Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, November 28th, 2021, and today we're going to be taking a look at a 2024 potential matchup between Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida and President Joe Biden. Now, this video has been recommended by many of you guys following my 2024 election prediction between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And I've actually been doing a bit of these 2024 predictions for quite some time now. Now, before we get into this, I want you to understand if you are new to this channel or you just need a recap of this, otherwise you can probably skip for the next 30 seconds or so, but this prediction is not meant for an eventual correct analysis of what 2024 might end up being, but rather a snapshot of today's current sentiment towards President Biden and towards the Republican Party, and how these potential candidates, if given a general election process through this day, meaning the election was held on November 28th, 2021, what would the map be? And that's what I'm going to be providing you with. So this is not meant for me to be some type of revolutionary thinker for the future about what will happen in 3 years from now. Rather, this is a momentary snapshot that will allow us in the future to take a look back at where the race stood at different points in time. So, in our 2024 prediction today, we are working with a brand new electoral map. This is the map that was confirmed by the United States Census Bureau, meaning it looks different than how it was back in the 2020 election, and that makes a lot of sense. We're going to be focusing primarily on this map, so we're going to get all of the easy things out of the way and then start to talk about why Ron DeSantis individually could even be in this position and why my prediction will end up the way it is. But to be very brief with it all, we're going to go through all of the safe states right now and not worry much about these safe states, primarily because we know how they're going to go. A safe state is any state that I personally believe will go to either political candidate by a margin of 15 points, 0.1 and higher, essentially meaning that it crosses that threshold that is needed in order for a state to be considered overall very solid for either political party. And I think that we will reach that in most of the states on the map right now. The Northeast is very solid for the Democratic Party, and of course, there are swing states, as they always are. You might be surprised to see states such as South Carolina and Alaska as not necessarily safe states, even though I can already tell you 3 years in advance who is going to win those states. Same thing with Oregon, but these are states that I don't believe in this new map would be decided by a margin of 15 points or higher. I do think that it would be very close, but there are very limiting factors for both Republicans and Democrats in many of these states that have to be recognized. Even though there is a very solid amount of Republican or Democratic support, they might be pushed down below that 15-point margin, or sometimes they just rarely get above it, and I don't think that this matchup would be a case in which either party was getting above 15 points in any of these remaining states. But there are congressional districts that vote differently than how the statewide vote actually is. But for the sake of this prediction, I do think that all of the districts here that I've yet to characterize will be considered to be in that region of anywhere between tilt, lean, and likely. And you can find all of the breakdowns for the percentages in the description box down below if you want to get a little bit more detailed. But Ron DeSantis, who is he? Well, he is the governor that ran back in 2018 in the state of Florida. He won by a margin of 0.4%. Right now, he's being floated as a very high name for the 2024 Republican presidential nomination. Even so much to a fact that in all of the polls that consider Ron DeSantis as a candidate without Donald Trump on the ballot, Ron DeSantis takes the lead, even above many senators such as Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and even former Vice President Mike Pence. Ron DeSantis is the clear favorite, if not Trump, then DeSantis. That's what I personally expect to see from the 2024 Republican presidential nomination. One thing that I think that Ron DeSantis really stands out upon is the fact that he is one of the more popular governors across the states. Taking a look at this poll, I believe this one's actually a bit done in the past. I do not think we will be talking much about this one, but there is another poll that shows that he has a 55% favorability rating across the state of Florida, even higher than President Trump's. Now, President Trump won the state of Florida back in the 2020 election. Ron DeSantis won by a narrower margin than Trump did both times, but as new polling data suggests, in the general election for the 2022 governor race, we expect Ron DeSantis to win by a pretty considerable amount. Now, keep in mind, Florida is a swing state, so if Ron DeSantis is up 9.5% against the only statewide Democrat, that's saying something. If Ron DeSantis is up 4.5% against the former Republican governor Charlie Crist, now a representative, ran for United States Senate and came to a pretty okay margin there, ultimately, it says a lot about Ron DeSantis as a candidate if he's doing so well. And you're talking about a 7-point difference from back just in August for his margin there in the state of Florida. So moving on into our general map here, Ron DeSantis is a top name because he's number one electable in his home state, Florida, which of course would be a huge plus for Republicans on the national map. In addition to that, Ron DeSantis is viewed in many ways as Donald Trump without the former baggage. And I think that's what ultimately puts him in a very powerful position as we go into the 2022 and 2024 election cycles. And I say 2022 because he's up for re-election. So we can go ahead and characterize all the states that I think will be likely for the GOP. And I don't think that many of these are coming as a shock. Specifically, Alaska and South Carolina. Those were the ones I was referencing earlier, where we 100% know who's going to win those races 3 years in advance. But it's not enough that I would say Ron DeSantis is winning Alaska by 17 points, 16 points, when Donald Trump only won it by 10. Same thing in South Carolina. I think it certainly could be up there to a point where it's nearing safe, but I don't think it's necessarily safe at this point in time. But besides those two states, we're going to consider Iowa and Ohio still likely states. I think that Ron DeSantis arguably would do worse in these two states than if Donald Trump was the nominee. Donald Trump individually had such a strong appeal to rural voters, but you cannot deny the fact that Ron DeSantis also taps into a very similar base. When I'm talking about him doing worse than Donald Trump in these two states, I mean marginally. It might be 2-3 percentage points, but I still could imagine Ron DeSantis winning 5.5% to 6%, somewhere around there in both of these states. I think that honestly, the GOP has a pretty good shot as we move into the next election cycle. Moving down into the southern region of the United States. This is also an area in which I think Ron DeSantis will do particularly well in. Absolutely, he's winning Texas. I see no doubt in my mind, especially with Joe Biden falling out of favor with the American public today. I can't even imagine what his approval rating is in Texas right now. Moving down to the state of Florida, Ron DeSantis, I also can imagine winning by a likely margin. Here's the thing. Florida doesn't necessarily like the Democratic Party right now. There's a reason why Democrats haven't been able to win statewide. And a lot of it can be attributed to the Florida Democratic Party and a number of missteps that they put forth. 2018 was supposed to be that redemption arc in which Bill Nelson ultimately fell flat on his face in that Senate election. He was actually a very strong candidate. In 2012, he won by an exceptionally large margin, won by double digits as a Democrat across the state of Florida in a race in which Barack Obama only won Florida by less than a percentage point. So when you had so much crossover support in the past for Bill Nelson in 2018, he ultimately ended up losing the same way that Andrew Gillum lost the governor's race against Ron DeSantis. And Democrats are very worried in 2022, and it makes sense. They have made a number of missteps over the past decade that has put them in such an unfortunate position. So looking at Florida today, I would not be surprised if Ron DeSantis was able to do better than Donald Trump would in the state, and you can actually see this in some statewide polls. Again, this is not a prediction for what will happen in 2024, more so a snapshot if we were to have the 2024 presidential election today, because that's the way that we have to take a look at American politics through this very instantaneous lens. And yeah, it's a little bit like horse race polling, but of course, it's just very interesting to see. And, why not? Why not take a look at a potential matchup here? But in the state of Florida, I do think that Ron DeSantis could actually tilt it over into the likely column for the GOP, which would be absolutely amazing for them, right? Put them in a very powerful position, meaning they would have to worry less about Florida and could focus more money and more effort into some other states. Maine's 2nd Congressional District, I previously characterized it as safe for Donald Trump. I would say at this point in time, it's going to be considered likely. Again, I think Ron DeSantis and Trump have very similar bases. That's why they both tend to lead in primary polling data for 2024, but I don't think that the appeal is as great and as large as one might think. And there might be some underperformances for Ron DeSantis in certain areas, even though he might end up winning certain regions of the country a little bit easier than Donald Trump would, or might be able to expand on the margin that Donald Trump ultimately had in some of these states. So, taking a look at our map right now, where does this put us? 219 electoral votes for Ron DeSantis and 172 for Joe Biden. So, Joe Biden, of course, has likely states. Which one are these? Well, let's go ahead and take a look. The first state that I would consider to be likely for Joe Biden is the state of New Mexico. I would also group Oregon in this. These two states typically vote with the Democratic Party. I would also say because of Colorado's overly large margin for Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential election, it's hard to see how Joe Biden falls about 10 points down in order for this state to be lean. I personally think that Joe Biden would still win Colorado, New Mexico, and Oregon by likely margins, but that's pretty much it for the overall likely margins. And then I think Maine's 1st Congressional District would be considered likely as well. So taking a look at this map, where does this put Ron DeSantis? Well, still 219 electoral votes. That simply is not changing. For Joe Biden, he's at 196. Now, as we approach into these next few states, I want you to recognize that there is sentiment here that is very much anti-Trump. For instance, you might have recognized if you watched my previous projection for Donald Trump and Joe Biden in 2024 that I characterized Virginia as a likely blue state. But for this map, I did not. And the reason for that is because, like Virginia and like many other places across the nation, this state individually and many other places does not necessarily disapprove of Republicans altogether, but rather the idea of Donald Trump. And for me to make this argument that Ron DeSantis would be not necessarily an embodiment of Trump is absolutely wrong, because it's not true. Ron DeSantis is. But in a very similar way that Glenn Youngkin approached this race, I think Ron DeSantis could do very well. Ron DeSantis is a good orator. He can talk his way in and out of many things, and I think that's a very important thing to note. Ron DeSantis isn't as out there as Donald Trump is, even though the ideology might be the same, even though the way they stand on certain issues might be the same. Ron DeSantis is not nearly as politically incorrect as Donald Trump, and I think that is something that goes a very long way. In Virginia, taking a look at Glenn Youngkin and Donald Trump side by side, there are not really that many differences. When it comes down to beliefs and stances on a bunch of fundamental issues, they are nearly the same person. Yet the Virginia Democrats couldn't equate the two, primarily because Youngkin was pushing away Trump, but also largely because Youngkin wasn't adopting Trump's strategy for the state of Virginia. And I don't think that Ron DeSantis would. So that's why Virginia specifically isn't in the likely column for the Democratic Party, and I think that could be a major help for Democrats, but also prove to be detrimental to Ron DeSantis overall by the time we reach the final map. And I think we should definitely take a look at that as we get closer to the map itself. So, moving into the states that I think would be lean for Ron DeSantis, I would definitely say we would be looking around the southern region again. That means states such as Georgia and Arizona would warm back up to the GOP. These aren't going likely for the Republican Party for the 2024 election, at least. Even if the election was held today, these are still states that are trending leftward. For the past 8 years, Arizona has been trending just over a point to the left every election year. They voted for Joe Biden by less than a point, and if that was to hold, he would win by about 4 points in 2024. That's why these states are still likely. Same thing in Georgia. Georgia has shifted significant amounts relative to 2012, over a point per year as well. And you can see this clearly in between midterm elections, specifically 2018 in the state of Georgia. These states do have leftward trends, but I do think that because of where it stands right now, Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump even would still be able to win both of these states, but it really does depend in the future about what the demographic breakdown looks like and the voting population, because it is a bit more conservative 3 years prior to the election. But again, acknowledging that the shift is still there is something that needs to be recognized, because it does make it more difficult for the GOP to win, and it probably means that they won't be winning these states by margins that they used to in the past. Moving over into the state of North Carolina, this is another state that I would characterize as lean for the GOP, and I would also characterize the state of Nevada and New Hampshire as lean for the GOP. Now, already we have Ron DeSantis above Joe Biden in this map, and that is something that really wasn't able to be done by President Trump in my head-to-head matchup. And the reason for that, North Carolina, I think that is one of those states that is always going to be close, but the GOP in 90%, 95% of scenarios has the advantage. And I don't think Ron DeSantis would be any different. But for Nevada and New Hampshire, there was specifically some good amount of anti-Trump sentiment. In New Hampshire specifically, when Donald Trump called New Hampshire a drug-infested den back in 2017, that was ran on ads in 2020. That type of rhetoric, that one type of spiel, for instance, that Donald Trump put forth to characterize the state of New Hampshire did do some numbers in that state. Now, had he not said it, would he have won the state of New Hampshire? No. New Hampshire was still going to go to Joe Biden, and it's no simple feat to win by 7.7%. It wasn't done by a mere one-statement notice. But if Donald Trump was able to win New Hampshire in my projection, I have full confidence that Ron DeSantis would also be able to, especially since he returns us to a normal sense of conservatism. I think that that's something that brings us back to how politics looked before Donald Trump, even though Ron DeSantis quite literally is an embodiment of Donald Trump. And that's the way that that's why many Democrats are terrified about Ron DeSantis. I actually covered this a few months back, where there was this article that was released that said that Democrats are terrified of Ron DeSantis eventually becoming president because they see it happening. While he still corrals that Trump base, he still wins over a significant portion a significant portion of the electorate. And that's why the favorability rating for Ron DeSantis is higher than Donald Trump's, higher than Joe Biden's, and higher than Kamala Harris. And that is super notable. As the governor of a swing state, you really don't tend to be that popular. But if he's up 10 points against a statewide Democrat, if he's up 5 points against the former governor, that tells you a lot about where he stands and what he can certainly do in terms of winning over voters that may have been turned off by President Trump in the past. Because that means with those polls, it implies there are a significant amount of voters that voted for both Biden that are comfortable voting for Ron DeSantis. As we finish off, we will still have some more lean red states, but I do want to give Joe Biden his lean blue states, and those are Maine and Virginia. This puts the current electoral map at 211 for Joe Biden, which means he's able to hold on to Maine, which is a state Hillary Clinton won. He's able to hold on to Virginia, but he's already lost a state that Hillary Clinton won in the 2016 election, and that is the state of Nevada. And I think, again, I mentioned that with Ron DeSantis' individual appeal and ability to detract from Trump's extremist points of view, but also still win over the same exact electorate. Very interesting to see. But for right now, Virginia and Maine are going to remain as lean states. Maine was lean in 2016, likely Virginia in 2016. But right now, Virginia is going to narrow down just a little bit, especially considering the 2021 shift altogether and how bad that actually was. Ron DeSantis will probably win Nebraska second by a lean characterization. He won't do as well as Romney, but he certainly will do better than Trump, at least for this map, probably as well as Trump did in 2016 in Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. And at this region right here, I am very conflicted because on one end, I do think that there is a good amount of support for the Democrats still remaining in the Rust Belt. That's why even against Trump, I had not moved these states over into the likely column. Iowa and Ohio can remain there, but Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are not entering likely for either political party for this projection. I'm also very conflicted about the state of Minnesota. I do think that Donald Trump does have a little bit of an advantage across the Rust Belt, especially since he was that one presidential candidate who was able to move them over. But I also think that he turned off a good amount of support when he came out with a lot of these statements, and many of the things that he had said, had he acted more quote-unquote presidential, he probably would have done better. And I think that certainly holds true for our map here. But for right now, I do think that Ron DeSantis does have the upper hand over President Trump when it comes down to electability, and thus Minnesota flips for the first time since 1976. Since 1972, actually. Minnesota currently holds the streak as the only state that voted for the Democratic Party during Reagan, the only state that has held with the Democratic Party since the 1972 presidential election. And yet, 2024, it could flip. I know I might get a little bit of pushback for this, but I want you to acknowledge that there is an advantage that Ron DeSantis has that Donald Trump could never tap into, and that is the presidential behavior. In addition to that, Ron DeSantis is one of the few candidates that I have been able to see as captivating the Trump base just as well, maybe narrowly worse, but nearly just as well as Donald Trump. And I think that in this matchup, considering that Joe Biden won Minnesota narrower than when he won in Virginia, and looking at that shift, there could be an argument, and I think the argument holds and stands right now for Ron DeSantis to win Minnesota against Joe Biden. So ultimately, the final map here, 327 electoral votes for Ron DeSantis, 211 for Joe Biden. This is a map actually from just 5 months ago, so a lot can change in a very short period of time. I want you all to recognize that. The approval rating for Joe Biden at this point in time was about +10. Today it's -10. So recognize, understand that the maps can be very different, and that's why I like to explore this data altogether. But this was just a brief flashback to where it was before, but this is how I believe the race would end up if the election was held today. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.